Images on Russian state TV, a show, appeared to demonstrate that Ireland would be wiped out if there was an undersea drone attack from a nuclear submarine. And Naomi O'Leary, Irish Times Europe correspondent, you keep an eye on Russian TV in terms of what it might say from time to time about Ireland. What did you make of this nuclear fantasy, a nuclear strike by an undersea drone that would cause a tsunami that would literally wipe out the populations of the two islands, Britain and Ireland?
It's very ugly. I mean, the graphic shows a wave, first of all, passing over the island of Ireland, then going on to Britain. And then, the voiceover says that it will be a radioactive desert, unfit for anything for a very long time after that. This is actually the third nuclear threat in about 3 days on Russian state TV that has included Ireland. Usually they refer to the British Isles. And this graphic quite explicitly showed Ireland being annihilated in its entirety. I think what's notable to see about this is, one, that this isn't an offhand remark. The graphics that were shown had been prepared in advance. So this is quite deliberate. It was something that was planned to be said. Also, who's saying it is Dmitry Kiselyov. He's a senior propagandist for the Russian state, and sometimes he's referred to as Putin's mouthpiece. So this is an insight into the thinking in Moscow. Obviously, it's a threat. Part of the, I suppose the purpose of it is a warning and to try and dissuade Western countries from helping Ukraine and from hindering Russia's objectives there. And I think really for Ireland, this is a kind of a taste of what Eastern Europe is used to. These sorts of threats about annihilation, invasion, and so on are sort of aired routinely on Russian state TV and have been for the countries along Russia's border. Ireland has been, a little bit more geographically distant from this, but this brings home the reality that, on the island of Ireland, there is part of the island of Ireland is in NATO, and our skies are, patrolled by NATO aircraft. So we are within that umbrella. That's the sort of geopolitical reality. Yeah. This is, how concrete it is as a threat. It's certainly something to take seriously because Russia, after all, followed through on one of these outlandish threats, which was to invade Ukraine. So they are prepared to do some of these things sometimes. And certainly it's a useful insight into the thinking of Moscow.
You wonder to what extent it's a response to Liz Truss's bellicose remarks. They are saying that Britain has actually threatened to nuke Russia, and this would be a response. So this kind of saber rattling, as you say, used to it in Eastern Europe, we're not used to being threatened in this way here.
There's been similar threats against Paris and Berlin. So one of the graphics that was shown in recent days showed the number of seconds it would take for a nuclear strike to hit Paris, Berlin and London comparatively. So it is very much targeting all the European capitals at this point. It's related to the support for Ukraine, particularly military support. The Russian state obviously wants the Ukrainian army to fail, and they do not like the Western support that has been rallied. So they want to stop that. And this is part of that. The United States and other allies certainly do take the nuclear threat quite seriously. It's something that senior members of the Russian regime have alluded to and referred to a number of times. When for example, in regards to the aspirations of Finland and Sweden to join NATO, they go to that nuclear threat quite quickly. So there is some concern that they could be prepared to use certainly smaller nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And in terms of what this means for Ireland, I think, it kind of illustrates that they probably don't think about us that much. I mean, they're using the term British Isles and including Ireland in their map. So there probably isn't in Moscow much of a distinction, much of an awareness.
Yeah. And of course, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom still.
Right. So the distinction of what's where, also Ireland is part of the EU, which is a massive problem for Russia and something that they're generally would like to fail. So, we are on kind of...
Now, Naomi, it's not your brief, but I'm just wondering, do you have any idea as to how this plays in Russia, all this kind of propaganda stuff?
It's hard to tell, but there have been surveys of Russian opinion of ordinary people. Now, how trustworthy these are, we don't know, but they show very strong support for the war. If you see, just commentary from I don't know, ordinary Russians who are vox popped on the street, for example, sometimes by international media, you'll often get this very bellicose responses. It's kind of like a lot of people agree with this, with the Russian state TV narratives. And if you think about it, it would be difficult for people to kind of marinate in that environment, and then suddenly start thinking differently, especially because it would mean believing really unflattering things about yourself and your family. Having to accept that maybe your family members have gone to launch a war in the wrong, to kill people in Ukraine who don't deserve to be killed and persecute civilians. It's much easier and nicer to think of them as heroes and to accept all of this sort of propaganda narrative about Russia's
the Germans, of course, had to come to terms with that reality after their defeat in World War II, that people had done things in ordinary Germans' names that didn't sit comfortably with them. The idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, which is what any nuclear strike by Russia would mean, whether or not we were overwhelmed by a tsunami, it would just result in the destruction of Moscow and all the major cities and all the assets of Russia in a matter of minutes. I mean, that's the reality of any nuclear war. So whether or not ordinary Russians think about that, I do not know. Anyway, Naomi, thank you very much for joining us. That's Naomi O'Leary, Irish Times Europe correspondent.